So for many of the last lessons, we've been deep into looking at sound and music under the microscope, specifically the spectrogram, where we've zoomed in and explored instruments and sounds through that lens. Today we're going to zoom way out and explore a history of musical instruments together. Most of the topics in this course I'm qualified to teach and have studied for most of my life. This, on the other hand, is something I'm just exploring with you. So apologies to the historians, and let's explore the internet together with a guided tour of the history of instruments. If you have your old black tea that's still... I spilled it on myself. I just spilled the tea on myself. If our task is to explore the first instruments of humans, then we could say the first instrument is the voice. It's the one that's built into us, and of course it stretches back to our very beginnings. Even before language, we could use our vocal folds to make sounds. But if we're talking about physical instruments made by humans, then around 60,000 to 40,000 years ago, we start to get the clearest evidence of instruments made by humans. Let's now look at the first flutes that we have record of. This bone was found in the Divje Babe cave in modern-day Slovenia. It dates back to about 50 or 60,000 years ago, and it is the bone of a cave bear, which is a species of bear that's long extinct, but is much larger than the modern bears that we know today. So it was the femur, the leg bone of a juvenile female cave bear, and it was found with other artifacts and remains of Neanderthals, so not even modern humans. Many archaeologists believe this is a flute that was carved by the Neanderthals from the bone, while some other archaeologists believe that this is simply the holes made by carnivores, for example, wild hyenas. If it is indeed a flute, then it's the oldest existing flute or instrument that we have. And it's interesting to think about it being from Neanderthals, not even modern humans, and from a long extinct species. After this, we have some very clear and conclusive instrument examples from about 40,000 years ago. This was found in Germany. This flute at the bottom here is carved from a griffin vulture bone, a naturally hollow bone of a bird of prey. So this is definitely conclusively a flute from about 40,000 years ago, and this would be from humans and not Neanderthals. And one other here, also found in Germany, which was carved from a woolly mammoth tusk. So ivory from a woolly mammoth. Woolly mammoths are, of course, extinct as well, but we did coexist with them 40,000 years ago. We didn't really look like this at the time, but this also, interestingly, would have been very difficult to carve from ivory because it was not hollow, so they must have found some way to hollow it out. These can stand as our first examples as we explore the history of musical instruments. Of course, it's possible there were many more types of instruments that went back even further, but we can't say that conclusively since this is the earliest evidence that we have. Other early instruments that we've found include bullroarers. There are examples of bullroarers from at least 18,000 years ago. And interestingly enough, they were invented in Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australia separately. And what these do is they cut through the air as you whip them around. It's basically a plate or some piece of wood that you whip around on a string. And as that piece of wood cuts through the air, it makes a roaring sound. And now we're going to skip forward to when the major leaps happened in instrument development, or at least those we know of. We skip forward to about 5,000 years ago, so you can put that around 3000 BCE. In ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, we have rattles, the earliest harps, lyres, other flutes, pipes, and bells, and drums. So we have a lot of what we'll talk about in the next lesson as the instrument categories in organology already represented at this point. And so ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia both reveal a lot of their musical instrument developments through images. So we know that there were instruments because we have these existing pieces of art that show ancient Egyptians and Mesopotamians playing these instruments. That includes a sistrum, which is basically a metal rattle. Ancient Egypt also had vertical flutes, so pipe flutes, and double clarinets. So a single reed instrument with two sides, and drums and harps. Let's leap another 1,000 years into the future, where about 4,000 years ago we see more lyres and harps, pipes and double reed instruments, frame drums, and also natural trumpets, like using a hollowed out horn for a trumpet, like the ancient Israeli shofar. Around 3,000 years ago, we have major developments in the area of music theory and instruments being crafted around numbers and the relationships of string length and pipe length. Some of these advances were made by names we know from mathematics, like Pythagoras and others. Around 2,500 years ago, we see some major developments in what we now would think of as percussion instruments, like xylophone-like instruments popping up in both Asia and Africa. I believe it's still unclear historically whether those were cross-pollinated or developed separately. And more stringed instruments in ancient China, along with bronze cast bells, which would be extremely difficult to tune, but once formed would keep their pitch very well. As we move toward about 2,000 years ago, we see a flowering and explosion of instruments and instrument development all over the world. Of course, everywhere in the world there has been music and instruments this entire time. I've just been trying to hit bullet points of the major advances in actual instrument building. So about 2,000 years ago, we get more and more metal gongs and percussion instruments in East Asia that will eventually lead toward modern gamelan music. In Europe, we have lots of different types of lutes and pipes, including the interesting carnyx, the Celtic giant trumpet. And then in the Indian subcontinent, we start to get an explosion of what will eventually become the tablas and sitars, etc. So even though we don't have modern instruments at this time, we now have probably most of the precursors to the modern instruments. So as we wrap up this lesson, I just wanted to talk briefly about how these instruments transitioned into modern instruments. As you probably know, today we have an enormous variety and diversity of instruments throughout the world, many of which are related, either historically or just through separate development. And obviously the whole modern Western orchestra of instruments, including the violin family, and before that the viol family of bowed instruments, came from earlier bowed instruments. And we also have the modern bowed instruments like rebab in the Middle East. And plucked string instruments really came into their own over the last couple thousand years by developing the string tension, bridges, and necks to keep the tension just right so the neck won't bow, etc. Brass instruments, we found ways to change the length of the brass pipe. When you press valves on a trumpet, you're increasing or decreasing the length of the pipe. And of course, a trombone does increase and decrease the length of its pipe. Keyed instruments like clarinets and oboes and bassoons are able to be longer than just this, so that our fingers can hit a few keys and cover holes that are much further away on a longer instrument. So you're able to advance from instruments you could just literally press the holes on to much bigger instruments that you could control holes on with keys. Percussion instruments continue to develop, especially the pitched percussion instruments like the modern gamelan, the African balafon and marimba. And finally, the zithers and harps, and the piano, which is one of the most impressive. The modern piano has, I believe, something like 30 tons of string tension on its cast iron frame. That makes it, gives it the ability to be as loud as we know it to be. So all of this just continues to spread and explode and cross-pollinate, and it's really one of the, in my opinion, remarkable achievements of humankind. These instruments that celebrate and intensify and collaborate between cultures. Hope you enjoyed this. Next time we're going to be getting into organology, which is the study of categorizing instruments. So we'll be getting more into the nitty-gritty of how do we understand instruments, how do they work, what produces the sound, and how do we categorize them. I'll see you there.